We'd like to thank everybody again for being here. Welcome to the initial 2014 Del Rio UFO Festival. Yay! So we have been very impressed by how the community has supported this event, and we have really enjoyed listening to all the speakers today. Those of you who were here to hear about the Star Child skull with Melanie Young, she did a tremendous job this morning, by the way. And Carlos Guzman, who brought us a report on how UFOs are becoming more prominent in the Mexican media, and he told us about several major UFO events. That was also fantastic. We appreciate Carlos coming from Mexico City. Stanton Friedman is always the most highly acclaimed speaker on UFOs in the world, and he'll be back after our presentation to bring us the latest astronomical findings about the probability of life in the galaxy and in the universe. So the figures have changed dramatically in the last 10 to 20 years to where scientists used to believe that our planet was unique in the galaxy to where now they're saying there could be billions of Earth-type planets. So you will definitely want to catch Stan's presentation on a new view of the cosmos. Our next presentation is one that Ruben Uriarte, who's here with me, my co-author and friend from California, and I have been doing around the country since 2008. So, but since then, there's been new details and new information that has come forward. And we're going to share with you some of the latest information. Incredibly enough, in the 1950s, there appears to be compelling evidence that there was a large UFO that was chased by a U.S. fighter jet and crashed just north of town here in the Langtree area. We first heard inklings of this story back around 2006, 2007, when Ruben and I were working on our first book together called Mexico's Roswell. The Mexico's Roswell case happened up near Presidio, and that was a mid-air collision between a UFO and a small plane. We've had several documentaries on the History Channel, and we've had actually 3 books written about this case already. The latest book is called The Koyama Incident. Now, we were so focused on the information about this case, talking to witnesses, we went down to Koyama, Mexico, in Chihuahua State, and we were talking to people, and we kept hearing this little buzz in the background about another case that had happened in the Del Rio area. So we Ruben and I just kind of filed it in our back memory, well, we've got to, once we get done with this book, Mexico's Roswell, once we get these obligations, we've got to look into that. And right around the time that we were finishing up the project, we had a breakthrough on the Del Rio incident. And that is that we found out that there had been a television special in which the pilot of the fighter jet that chased the UFO before it crashed was interviewed by a television station in Dallas-Fort Worth by a reporter named Robert Ray for a series of shows that they were doing called the Text Files. Instead of X-Files, Text Files. Pretty catchy. Well, that was around the time that X-Files was very popular on TV. One of my favorite shows of all time, obviously, those of you who know me. And I have the whole series on DVD. And you can also watch them on Netflix, by the way, all seasons. But anyway, they did this reality Text Files series in which they talked about famous UFO cases in the state of Texas. And they did, I think, 8 or 10 of them. Well, one of the ones that they did, and they broadcasted in the year 2000, was an interview with a gentleman named Robert Burton Willingham, and who was a veteran of World War II. He was in the Korean War as well, and he became a pilot in the Air Force Reserve. And when we found out that this documentary had run on Dallas TV, we finally had a breakthrough, right, Ruben?
Yeah, it was quite unique that that came out, and then after that we were able to track down Robert Willingham, where both Noe and I have extensively interviewed him in person at his home.
Do you remember that first phone call we made? And
yeah, it was like...
He was very suspicious of us, and he wasn't very free in giving us much information. But Ruben has a way. This gentleman can put people at ease, and he's very genuine and kind-hearted. And Colonel Willingham really took to Ruben. Do you remember some of what the Colonel told you right at the beginning?
He said a lot, but the thing that I respect a lot our veterans, and the thing that amazed me quite a bit was that we learned about Willingham, not just his UFO experience, but he has a broad background. He served in World War II, and we'll be talking about, and also in Korea. And he's a jet fighter pilot, and I really have a high respect for pilots anyway.
So we'll tell you more about Colonel Willingham, and you know, it's an amazing story. He showed us books and books from his personal collection of little memoranda from his time in the military, photographs, awards that he won for his military career. In the town square at Archer City, there's a tribute to all veterans of World War II in Korea, and his name is engraved there. We went up in front of that monument, and we took a picture with him for the book. And, you know, we found him, and speaking to him for countless hours over the course of years, we found that his story never varied, and it didn't vary from the story that he was telling in the 1960s and 70s, when he was starting to tell people about what happened to him near Del Rio in the 1950s. So we thought he was a credible person, and that's how we got started.
You know, one of the comments that I've been hearing out there in the lobby at our booth is from the folks here in Del Rio says, "How come we haven't heard about it? How come we don't know about it?" No, you were going to find about it now, but that's a good question. It's been a case that's not that well known for some reasons that Noe and I will get into.
The most amazing part of that, what Ruben just said, is that this story was well known within the field of UFO research long before the Roswell case was known, believe it or not. The first book about Roswell was published in 1980. Stanton Friedman, one of our speakers here, did the research for the Roswell incident. Although he wasn't given credit as an author in that book, it was Charles Berlitz and another gentleman whose name eludes me now. However, Stan Friedman was the one who went and interviewed Colonel Jesse Marcel, the public information officer at Roswell back in 1947, who issued the earth-shattering press release, "The U.S. government has captured a UFO on a ranch in Roswell." So 1980 was when the first book about Roswell was published. The Del Rio UFO crash case was known back in the 1960s, as we will show you momentarily. So, yeah, Roswell stole all our press, but Ruben and I have been engaged for the last 10 years in trying to get that back. I mean, Texas deserves that. Del Rio deserves that.
And that's why we have the UFO Del Rio Festival. Thank you.
We are the new Roswell. Okay, So Ruben and I were hearing rumors of something that had happened here in 1955. The military came in and they hushed it up big time in a real big hurry. They floated rumors of, possibly a plane crash. There was a lot of smoke screens. There were roadblocks set up and things like that. When we looked at this case initially, there were three possible locations that were brought to our attention. And I want to show you, first of all, this is what we finally settled on after extensive conversations with Robert Willingham, the pilot who chased this UFO and saw it crash. This is the location that we actually talk about in our book. But prior to settling on that, we had been directed in many different directions by other UFO researchers and other witnesses. And there was a mention, first of all, of a similar type incident 30 miles southwest of Laredo, Texas, on July 7, 1948. This is a very interesting case, and whenever I've spoken about this case, which Ruben and I have spoken in Laredo about this, it doesn't have a lot of substantiation to it. There's not a lot of documentation. It's very circumstantial. And whether it was a real event or just the crash of something experimental, we don't know for sure. Apparently the military hauled everything off the way quickly. And so we don't have much information on that. It is interesting. The folks in Laredo are very interested to find out more. And we're continuing our research. Ruben has some connections with UFO investigators in Mexico, and we had heard some chatter about possibly getting some information from the Army commander for that sector,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that's an ongoing investigation. So that was a scratch. That wasn't the big one that people were talking about. So then we went on to supposedly UFO crash at Los Indios, Texas, Guerrero, Mexico area, December 6, 1950. It turns out that there's absolutely no evidence of any kind that we've been able to find in many years about anything happening there. There is a mention of a UFO crash in the Los Indios Guerrero area on December 6, 1950 in a document called the Eisenhower Briefing Document, or EBD, well known to UFO researchers. It's a document that it was a brief that was supposedly prepared for incoming President Dwight D. Eisenhower, telling him that, and the memo says specifically that a crash had occurred at Roswell, New Mexico, 1947. Bodies had been recovered, and a second crash had occurred in the Los Indios Guerrero area, which, puts it around 100 miles from here, closer to Eagle Pass. Now, the reason I'm taking some time to tell you about this is because whenever you visit websites about the Del Rio UFO crash, people have gotten the dates and these possible locations mixed up with Colonel Willingham's story. Some people say that Colonel Willingham's crash near Del Rio was on December 6, 1950. Totally untrue. We sat with Willingham in his living room and he said, I never told him 1950. I don't know where that date came from. And other people get it mixed up with this supposed UFO crash near Laredo in 1948, and they'll say Colonel Willingham saw a UFO, chased it in his F-86, it crashed near Del Rio in 1948. Incorrect. In 1948, he was still in the Army. The Air Force had not even been created yet. I think it was 49 or 50.
We're on that time frame, please.
So the only time frame that fits, based on the records that Colonel Willingham showed us of his military service, the time when he was in Korea and then went on because of a battle injury in Korea. He was not allowed to fly actual missions anymore, so he went in order to maintain his ability to fly. They told him he had to go into the Air Force Reserve, which he did. So the only time frame that fits is 1955. Now, he doesn't remember the exact date. Colonel Willingham, you know, he's told us on several occasions, this was one day in my life. He's in his mid-80s now. This was one day in my life, and I was at the scene of this UFO crash for less than 30 minutes. So you're asking me about something that happened 50, 60 years ago, and something that was a brief moment in my time, in my life. So he's also unfortunately had medical problems, yes. A couple of strokes, which have also hurt his ability to recall dates and figures. He had a series of strokes in the 1970s. So the bottom line is we have an estimated date of 1955 based on Colonel Willingham's military records. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. The movie with James Stewart that was made in 1955 was filmed in Cargill Air Force Base, and Willingham shared with us that he actually was in that movie showing where his jet fighters and himself were flying escort for a bomber. So that really tied into the 1955.
Ruben's mic is a little bit high. I don't know if you all
I woke him up.
Able to turn that down. Okay. So Colonel Willingham actually tried to tell his story back in the 1960s. We found the earliest instance of him talking about it, we found in a newsletter called Skylook, dated February and March 1968. And this was a forerunner of the MUFON Journal, which is one of the leading publications about UFO sightings today, put out by the Mutual UFO Network, of which Ruben and I are members. And Ruben is the director of MUFON for Northern California. And so Skylark, in Skylark, this 1968 issue, the article says pilot R.B. Willingham was leading a squadron of jets near the Mexican border when he was informed that the UFO had crashed on the border. He went to the site to investigate, but found that Mexican authorities were already there. So, you know, just a little over 10 years after the incident reportedly happened, it was documented in this article. And then in 1977, Colonel Willingham gave an affidavit to one of the leading civilian UFO organizations of the time, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, also known as NICAP. NICAP had some of the heavy hitters in UFO research associated with it, such as J. Allen Hynek and others, high-powered scientists, researchers, studying the issues associated with UFOs. So he gave this affidavit in which he says they reported on the scope that they had an unidentified flying object at a high speed going to intercept our course. We got to watching how it made 90-degree turns at this high speed and everything. We knew it wasn't a missile of any type, so then we confirmed it with the radar control station on the DEW line, distant early warning line, and they kept following it, and they claimed that it crashed somewhere off between Texas and the Mexico border. We got a light aircraft, me and my pilot, and we went down to the site. We landed out in the pasture right across from where it hit. We got over there, they told us to leave and everything else, and then armed guards came out and they started to form a line around the area. So on the way back, we saw a little piece of metal, so I picked it up and brought it back with me. This was actually the core of the story of what happened that day that we're going to now expand on. It looked like something that was made because it was honeycomb. You know how you would make a metal so that it would cool faster? In a way, it looked like magnesium steel, but it had a lot of carbon in it. I tried to heat it with a cutting torch, it just wouldn't melt. Cutting torch burns between anywhere from 3,200 to 3,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and it wouldn't make the metal hot. But it wouldn't even start the metal to yield. Now people always ask me, well, how come there was a crash and there was debris if this metal was so resistant? Well, Colonel Willingham believes that there was an internal explosion of whatever tremendous power source is used to power these craft. And that incredible energy is what basically pulled the ship apart. One of the most famous UFO researchers of all time, Leonard Stringfield, he's known as the father of modern UFO research, the father of UFO crash retrieval research. He's unfortunately passed away some years ago, but this was a case that Leonard Stringfield was very interested in. It was on the front burner of the few UFO cases that he really liked. And he wrote this in one of his newsletters from 1978, in which he says, Todd Zeckel, UFO investigator, relates the following. I traced another Air Force colonel, now retired in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is where Willingham was at the time. He had seen the UFO in flight. He was flying a jet fighter when reports came of a UFO on the West Coast, flying over Washington State. Radars clocked its speed at over 2,000 miles per hour. Again, we have evidence that Colonel Willingham was trying to tell his story long before he finally told us the complete story for our 2008 book. It had been known to UFO investigators long before the Roswell, New Mexico case came to light. So he goes on to say in this quote from Leonard Stringfield, it made a 90-degree angle turn and flew east over Texas. The colonel, then a captain pilot, actually saw it as it passed. Then suddenly it disappeared from radar screens. Radar operators plotted its course and decided it had crashed some 30 miles across the Mexico border. When the captain got back to base, he and a fellow pilot got in a small plane and took off over the border after the UFO. When they landed in the desert at the crash site, troops were there before them.
アメリカ南西部中心でUFOが墜落し、その長いと乗っていた宇宙人の死体が回収されたという事件は、ウィリングハム大佐1950年12月7日、墜落する UFO を追ってメキシコ国境を越え、自宅した巨大な円盤を至近距離から見たという。あの日の朝6時半頃でしたから、私は F94 ジェット戦闘機に乗って、我々はウィリングハム大佐と一緒に、その UFO 墜落現場を上空から訪れていることにした。UFO はアビリン市の上空を通過して突然直角に退し、国境を越えてメキシコ側へ墜落したのだ。テキサス州デルビー市から北東沿いに西へ向かい、アムスタッドダムを経由して、最も近い地点から国境を越え、現場に向かうことにした。チャレン当時にはまだできていなかった巨大な貯水池アムスタッドダムが建設。このダムの水門を境にして、アメリカ側とメキシコ側に分かれているのだ。我々が出発する前、ちょっとした事件があった。国境を越えるについて、メキシコ側の了解を求めたところ。
We put that out for all the Japanese speakers out in the audience. How many of you understood that?
I see a row of hands up. Okay.
Now, we just wanted to, this is just a short clip of a much larger, that was filmed in 1978, and this was a bonanza for us. It was a tremendous discovery because the leading television network in Japan came all the way to Del Rio, and they crossed the border here. They went over Amistad in a plane. The colonel took them right to where this happened, and it was a sensation in Japan in 1978. And Ruben, we just kind of stumbled into this Japanese video which we had translated. Tell them how we found that.
It just so happened, I have a very good friend of mine named Mark Uriarte, has the same last name like me.
No relation.
No relation, but there might be a connection. We're trying to figure that out. But Mark served in the Air Force. He was a captain, also worked in intelligence. He has a great, interesting background. But it just so happened that we're talking, and I was telling him that both Noe and I were working on this case, this Ruben. You know, it just so happens that I have this video about that case. I said, what? And then he showed it to me. It was the Japanese documentary, and I called him Noe immediately. I said, Noe, you've got to see this. This is outstanding.
What are the chances that somebody in Southern California, Northern California, sorry, would have a Japanese television documentary from the 1970s about the very case that we were working on at the time? We had our book almost finished. So that's synchronicity. It's got to be.
It's just how it follows, piece by piece. I'm certain that somebody out there in the audience may know of someone or have heard something that can also be that really important connection.
So some folks have asked the question, how come nobody here in Del Rio had heard of this, or not many people? Well, the answer is people in Japan knew about it. You guys were sleeping or what? I don't know. The whole world has known about this.
Yeah, almost 34 years later.
All right, you might have noticed in the flyover that they did over Amistad and looking down upon the crash site near Langtree. These are some of the screen captures I did. Now the quality, it's a VHS transfer to a DVD and then a transfer to a computer file, multiple generation transfers. It's not, this is as clear as I use Photoshop, I use filters, and this was the best I could do. But here's the 90-degree angle turn as the Japanese broadcasters described it. Willingham was approaching in an F-86, and we'll give more detail about that in a minute. And then there was this 90-degree angle turn that the UFO made. Came down to the Langtree area, and then there was an impact site just on the other side of the Rio Grande. So, historical point of reference, as we already mentioned briefly, 1978, Stanton Friedman, who is right out here in the lobby, and you can verify this with him, interviewed Jesse Marcel, the only person known to have accompanied the Roswell UFO crash debris from where it was recovered to Carswell Air Force Base. Marcel revealed to Stan that the debris came from a crashed UFO, and Friedman's research into the case elevated Roswell from a forgotten incident to perhaps the most famous UFO case of all time. I told Ruben that if only we had gotten the word out before that, we would have beaten Stan Friedman to the punch, and everybody would be talking about the Del Rio UFO crash. So the first book about the Roswell crash was published in 1980, and it was called The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz, famous travel writer, and William L. Moore. So that's why Ruben and I called our book The Other Roswell. We probably should have called it The Real Roswell, or The One Before Roswell. But we went through, we wrote down a whole bunch of possible titles, and the one that seemed to convey it most simply was The Other Roswell.
Roswell going with UFO crash, and we use the term Roswell. That makes it
right. It's really the first Roswell, maybe is what we should call it. Colonel Willingham, as we mentioned, was in the Air Force Reserve when this happened. He was born in 1926 in Holiday, which is near Archer City. Anybody know where Archer City is? Up near Wichita Falls. It's where Larry McMurtry is from, famous novelist. Colonel knows McMurtry and has been over to his mansion. He has a very nice large home there in Archer City. So the Colonel knows him, and McMurtry owns several businesses in town to this day. He was part of the combat engineers, served on the General Patton. He was involved in the post-World War II reconstruction of Berlin. He saw service in the Korean War. He flew P-51 Mustangs in Korea until he was wounded in December 1950. So then there was this report in the year 2000 that I mentioned at the beginning. This was our first breakthrough. The Japanese video came after this one. But our first breakthrough was this KDFW report by Richard Ray, which we're going to watch now. It's a very short clip, about 5 or 6 minutes.
Captains Adams and Anderson, commercial pilots, draw a sketch of the flying saucer they both saw while piloting a plane between Little Rock and Memphis.
For a time in the early 50s, flying saucers were headline news.
Well, that's going pretty fast. That's just going these days.
Thousands of sightings by credible witnesses like these pilots.
He examined the whole aircraft from height. I don't think it's necessary.
They reported seeing a large craft moving at a high rate of speed, honeycombed on the bottom with a dome and a light on top. But no rash of sightings quite compares with what happened on Winter's Day in 1950. A strange sequence of events that ended with a crash of something near Delaware, Texas. But the story gets even stranger.
It's very possible that at least one of those objects continued traveling southward across the United States in the direction of Texas.
A pilot named Colonel Robert Willingham claimed that he was flying out of San Angelo, Texas, when he was alerted by a radar operator that a UFO was headed toward him. According to Willingham, the object traveled faster than and maneuvered unlike any aircraft he'd ever seen. 5 decades later, at least one witness survives. We found him, retired Colonel Robert Willingham in Archer City, Texas.
I don't think we had a guided missile or any kind of missile that would travel on a level flight like that would travel.
Willingham says he and the co-pilot returned to base and immediately went searching for the crashed UFO.
We got a lot of aircraft that hit too far to earth out of Bracken. We fished on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande. Went on down there and about that time, colonel from the Mexican Army come up and told us to get ready. And we did get a little look at we were first bull chestnut, and it kind of looked to me like a fish or something.
Willingham has suffered a stroke and admits his memory is not what it used to be, but on key points the story he tells today matches with an affidavit he gave in 1977. Especially so on a chunk of metal he retrieved from the crash site. Honeycomb, he says, light as a feather, like nothing he'd ever seen before.
4 or 5 days later, we took that piece of metal and put it on the grinder and cut and pull it and tried to mine it and everything else. Couldn't do nothing with it. And I think the weather.
Still curious, Willingham says he took the metal to a marine testing lab in Maryland. But when he tried to retrieve it, he was told the danger he given it to did not exist. What Willingham saw and his willingness to talk about it did not apparently harm his military career. He spent 48 years working in one capacity or another for Uncle Sam. A commendation from President Reagan and the American Security Council hangs on his wall. But he was warned over the years to clam up.
He just said, I'm from the military club. Said, don't say nothing else. About almost 2,200 miles an hour, like a man would return. We don't have nothing for days. I don't think.
Okay, sorry for the audio wasn't as good as we'd like, but once again, it was a transfer from video and off of transfer to a computer file. But I think you got the basic gist of the Colonel's story has remained consistent. He was in a jet fighter. He was in the Air Force Reserve. The group of flyers that he was with was suddenly approached by a very bright UFO. And so the story has been consistent. So we're going to take you back to that day in the spring of 1955. And as has already been mentioned, and Colonel Willingham mentioned, the UFO was spotted in the northwestern U.S. near Washington State, and it was moving very fast toward Texas. And at the same time, this convoy of planes, B-47 bombers, B-51 bombers, escorted by jet fighters, was making its way from Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth all the way to El Paso. So this is the path that they were following roughly. And they were just short of where the orange line is when the UFO passed in front of them and suddenly executed this more or less 90-degree turn toward the border. So here's a representation of the B-47, and there was a box formation of jets around it. And Ruben, you want to pick up the description there?
Yes. They were flying escort for, as Noe had mentioned, for a group of B-47 bombers. And if you see on your bottom corner on the right-hand side, Willingham's jet. And one thing that we, in our research, because the other documents mentioned that it was flying an F-94, which was a two-seater at the time, an interceptor, and then the F-86 was a single-seater fighter. And the question I asked him, well, who was your backseat pilot with? He says, what backseat? He says, I flew, it was just me. And I said, well, what kind of plane was it? He said, an F-86 Super Sabre. No, F-86 Sabre. So both Noe and I were really focused in on that and came up with this map, kind of shows this position and where it shows the object flying right in front of the flight formation.
I was thinking at the time he did that there was somebody up supposed to Oregon somewhere or Washington had come on the radio and said that. I don't think they were talking to my figure, the people I was with. That came a little late, and they asked about, are you saying? And that's when the B-47 pilot said, yes, we've got contact with them. Yeah, and then all they wanted to make that 90-degree turn, took off.
So in that clip, Colonel Willingham says that there was radar contact made from the B-47 that they were escorting. And
this was, both Noe and I were on the phone with him, so these are tape recordings on the phone of our conversation, and then we have some audio, visual material shown here.
Well, it kind of looked like, at first, like a star, but it was just a explosion. Real bright light. There's a little amber-looking coloring there once, or I thought it was, because I didn't know, but it's very bright, and I'd say before it made the 90-degree turn, it would look like it was that big to me right there, but you know, it might have been 40 miles back from where or 80, you never know.
there was an interesting thing about Colonel Willingham when we interviewed him. He would be very talkative and very upfront, but once we turned a tape recorder on or a camera on, he became very hesitant because he knew that a public record was being made, and he still was suffering, in my opinion and Ruben's opinion, the effects of years of intimidation by the military, in which he was told in no uncertain terms that he was never to reveal what had happened to him down by the border, as he was told it. So we noticed when we were visiting with him in Archer City at his residence that he was very aware of, he would pull back the curtains and look to see what vehicles were driving past his house. And he was really, he really expressed concern for his safety and the safety of his family. So a lot of the conversations that we had where he was most lucid and he really explained things well to us was, for example, in our phone conversations back and forth. Because whenever we tried to get him on record in a film situation, he was hesitant to talk very much.
And about that time, we made a 90-degree bump to the right, and drove about 2,000 miles an hour, and I knew that wasn't no airplane. And went over there a little bit, and I said, when we get through here, I'm going to go look at that. And so they went on to Washington, state of Washington, and another fighter escort picked them up over there about the line of Oregon, and I turned around and went back to the forward, and then I got a small plane and went down to where that thing looked like it crashed.
Okay, we're running a little short.
It was coming.
We're running a little short.
The river comes up around within, I say 3/4 or a mile back towards Judge Roy Dean's place. And it was just about 100 feet on the other side of the river.
Okay, just to cover the slide that I skipped past, he said that shortly after the object made a 90-degree angle turn without slowing down, he noticed that there were sparks and that the object started to tilt at about a 45-degree angle toward the ground. And then it started descending fairly rapidly, and it made impact just on the other side of the Rio Grande. We've got a satellite map here. And Colonel Willingham, who had been out hunting in this area, he told us, was familiar with the landmark of the Judge Roy Bean Visitor Center area. So he knew that this had happened just across the river from there. This is a satellite flyby that I captured on my computer to give you an indication of the angle at which the object would have been coming in. And then the little red dot that you see is the approximate crash location. It's a Rio Grande. It just crashed on the other side on a ridge, kind of elevated from the river. So, go on to this.
I went back and put my aircraft up, went over to CAP place, got one of their little light planes, and we flew this down there. Like a rocket. No lights, no radio, no that. It was just a simple airplane. We lucky to get it back in those days, too.
So they took this small plane. It had no lights. Basically, it was a stripped-down trainer, and they went down and put it down right next to the crash site.
I'd say there was probably a platoon level, enlisted type, and the rest of them were government and officers. And there was about 15 or 20 of us. And yeah, they were just looking at everything because it was still red hot. And they were staying back pretty close. I told one of them, I said, you better not grab a hold of that. That stuff's still red hot.
This was the diagram that Colonel Willingham drew of what he saw as he was coming in. He was landing the Aeronica plane right here along the river, just up on the ridge. He estimates that the object bounced, or he thinks the object bounced and then created a skid path and then came to rest in several sections, the major part of the wreckage being up at the front of this. And he said that there were soldiers all around forming kind of a perimeter. And that he saw Mexican military vehicles, mainly jeeps and military sedans.
We're talking with Colonel Willingham about a day in 1955 that is utterly extraordinary. And the story is all the more extraordinary because he lived it, he was in the Air Force, he is telling the story now. And there are so many people in the military who know things, see things, experience things, participate in things, who take it with them. This is one of the men who did not do that, and we are eminently and eternally grateful for this information. All right, Colonel Willingham, if you would, sir, please take it from the top. 1955, what was happening on that day when this whole thing began to unroll?
We were assigned to a wingtip watch over 47 that left up in New York, came down through Oklahoma and down through Archer County and back over and went to El Paso, and we were supposed to fly cover for it.
Now, when you say 47, you're talking about a B-47?
Yes.
Okay. And why were you flying cover for a B-47?
Well, I wasn't told why I was supposed to, it told to do it.
I'll bet you were just told to do it. Could it possibly be that that B-47 was carrying a certain something in its bomb bay?
It could have had.
Okay.
Pretty heavy one too, I think.
Just fishing. All right, so you're flying cover. Now, you and how many fellow pilots?
Four of us.
Four, right.
Four of us at Dallas.
Were you boxing?
Four.
Out of Fort Worth, were you boxing in front and rear and side to side?
Yes, just exactly.
All right, I got the picture now. B-47, for any of you who want to know, can simply type in B-47, the numerals, on any search engine. You'll see a picture of this jet bomber, which was carrying obviously a very special cargo at that time on that day. All right, sir, go right ahead.
We flying along there, and my buddy back there sits on my unicorn between the aircraft. He said, "Hey, look at that big star falling, or whatever it is over there." And I looked at it, and everybody else looked at it, and I said, "You sure that's a star?" I said, "It looked to me like it's something else." And it was real bright. Finally, it made a 90-degree turn at 2,000 miles an hour, and I didn't figure it was.
Well, shooting stars and meteorites don't change course. Not like that.
That's right. So I asked Captain on 47 if I could trace it, see where it was going, but we didn't know what it was. He came back a few minutes and he said, "Yeah, go ahead, just shoot them, not the rest of it." So I took off down there, and when I got to where the guns were below landing through Texas, on the over on the Mexican side.
That thing actually just took an absolute flat-on-out 90-degree change in direction at 2,000 miles an hour, leaving a contrail of some kind behind it.
Right.
That must have just knocked your eyeballs.
It sure did. I was hoping to have one by the next year that I could fly myself.
Spoken like a true aviator hero. That's great. All right, so it makes a 90-degree turn. At that point, did it begin to descend below your flight altitude?
Yeah, sure did. We flying on about 35,000 at that time. I took off after it, and it don't hit about the time I got about halfway up.
Okay, it dropped below you.
And then I had to kind of circle around.
Mm-hmm.
And that time, the Mexican government, they had started sending in their troops over.
All right, so by the time you took you 5 to 8 minutes to drop down, to get close to the deck to see this thing, which you could tell, I guess, from before you got there, had come in for some kind of an impact landing.
Well, I don't think he was trying to land. I think he already lost control of it.
I see.
Or that was my idea.
Mm-hmm. As you're coming down toward the Rio Grande River, and you're coming down, and this thing is on the ground, as you approach it, what do you see exactly?
I just seen where he had hit about 100 yards up from the water bank, and kind of bounced a few times, and just kept on going. I'd say it went out through there about 1,000 yards.
Did you actually see it, Colonel, hit the ground?
Well, I didn't actually see it hit the ground. I seen it when it finally got stopped. I had got that close
I see.
that I could see it.
Uh-huh. All
But
right.
it was breaking up pretty bad there when I seen it.
All right, so you're standing there with your arms up in your flight suit next to this little private plane, and you're 150 yards away from this crash disk. How many soldiers were there approximately there? Were they deployed in a circle around it, or what?
No, there's about, I'd say 150 there when I got there
All right, so quite a number.
already.
Mm-hmm.
And about 35 vehicles.
Wow, all right. Could you see
And
the
the vehicles on both sides.
all right, could you see the craft itself?
Yeah, I went in there and I was talking to this Spanish lieutenant. Anyway, I talked to him, and we walked down through there, and he said, I never seen anything like it before. And I said, no, I haven't either, but I said, this fact's a little different than some I've looked at. This is here has some solid pieces still scattered down through there.
All right, so some of it was intact. Did it have any markings or anything on the exterior, or was it just the skin of it?
Well, no, I picked up a little piece of it on the way out of there.
Was there any evidence of any life, dead or alive, around that object?
They were on up front, according to them. They said some look like people, but said we can't let you go up there. The general already said nobody looked at that.
So,
They didn't even expect the boys that was guarding it look at it.
oh really?
Yeah.
Okay, so the front of the craft that impacted the ground ripped a hole open inside, and apparently people could see in there, and there were dead ETs, or they weren't humans, there were dead bodies in there of some kind.
Right.
And you couldn't get around there to see in there either.
Well, I kind of snuck around a little.
You're a sneaky fellow, aren't you? All right, now tell me, you snuck around there a little bit, Colonel. What did you see?
Well, it didn't look like human beings to me.
How many of them were there?
I believe there were 3, and the lieutenant said they were 4.
All right.
I never did see the other.
Were the bodies mangled, or were they relatively intact, and what were they dressed in?
Well, they weren't dressed at all,
Okay?
and they were in a lot of different pieces. I didn't see but one that had a complete top, but I wasn't sure what he was eating.
All right, what did the head look like? Anything like we've seen in the common research literature, the big eyes, the smooth skin, the little mouth? Did you see anything?
Yeah, there's some of them that look like that. They just, I don't know how you explain it, but they just, their heads, arms and stuff, their arms are little bitty. They look like broomsticks.
Wow, okay. But they had, broomsticks. All right, no, I got you. They had no uniform on. They were just basically skin, if that's what their outer covering is.
Yeah.
No, any evidence of blood?
I didn't see any.
Okay,
But
they were, they
man,
all,
I just got the glance in there, because he wouldn't let me go look in it. I just happened to be walking by and looking in there, you know, and he said,
Yeah.
"Oh, you can't do this, you gotta come over here."
you're a smart man, I'm glad you did. The colonel actually got a look, listeners, I'm sure you're right on this, of the occupants of that craft, all dead on impact apparently.
It's an amazing story. Actually, our presentation goes on for 2 hours, so you all want to free up the rest of the evening? We can have everybody else just cancel their talks? No? No, they're not buying it. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We have a lot more information about this case in our book, The Other Roswell. We have a few copies left. Most of the are gone.
Yeah, they're just about gone.
And you can order it from Amazon.com. Just do a search for The Other Roswell. Thanks a lot for your kind attention. Stanton Friedman will be here in 10 minutes. Thank you. 10 minutes with a new view of the cosmos.